Hey there. Good morning. Welcome to Mornings in the Word with Bold Faith Church. I am Vina Henry, and today is day 290 of our chronological reading of the Bible. Um, Before we head into the reading of the Bible, I'd like you to subscribe, like the channel, share. Um, and we are here every Monday to Friday at 7 a.m. EST. And then we're back here on a Saturday at 8 a.m. EST for the word of Pastor Courage Molina. Um, let's jump into the reading. We're on chapter 14 in Matthew, then we're going to read chapter 6 in Mark and Luke 9, verses 1 through 17. It says, when Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, heard about Jesus, he said to his advisers, "This must be John the Baptist, raised from the dead. That is why he can do such miracles." For Herod had arrested and imprisoned John as a favor to his wife, Herodias, the former wife of Herod's brother, Philip. John had been telling Herod, "It is against God's law for you to marry her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of a riot because all the people believed John was a prophet. But at a birthday party for Herod, Herodias' daughter performed a dance that greatly pleased him. So he promised with a vow to give her anything she wanted. At her mother's urging, the girl said, "I want the head of John the Baptist on a tray." Then the king regretted what he had said, but because of the vow he had made in front of his guests, he issued the necessary orders. So John was beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a tree and given to the girl, who took it to her mother. You have to be careful with the promises you make, the vows you make, right? Um, Later, John's disciples came for his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus what had happened. As soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was and headed and followed on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. That evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it is already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "This isn't necessary. You feed them." "But we have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here," he said. Then he told the people to sit down on the grass. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up towards heaven, and blessed them. Then, breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterwards the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. I know you've heard this before, but it's always repeated. Every time I read this, I'm just reminded that sometimes we think what we have is not enough. But when we offer it up to Jesus, our little to him, what we have becomes more than enough because he is enough. He is more than enough. And so this story just reminds me every time I read it that the little I think that is not enough, it's not good enough, how will it ever be enough for the people around me? It's a reminder, take it to Jesus, take your little to Jesus, and with his touch, with his blessing, um, he can multiply what you have and it becomes enough, right? So you are enough. What you have is enough. Um, Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake. While he sent the people home, after sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified, and he began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. After they had crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret, where the people recognized Jesus. The news of his arrival spread quickly throughout the whole area, and soon people were bringing all their sick to be healed. They begged him to let the sick touch at least the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were healed. Another story that is so familiar for me, anyways, but it's in this story, the disciples are caught in a storm, and Jesus approaches them and they don't recognize him, which is a reminder that sometimes when we're in the midst of our struggles, when we're in the midst of a trying season, our fear sometimes can keep us from seeing God's hand, could keep us from seeing and feeling his presence, right? We know him, but in the midst of our storm, in the midst of our troubles, we allow fear to be what's most present, right? We allow fear to be bigger than what we know about God, which is that he never leaves us. He's always there, right? We're never in the storm alone. And so Jesus approaches them and they don't recognize him, although they had spent the whole day with him. And it also stood out to me that Peter asked for him to prove that it was him, right? "If it is you, call me to come out on the water." And he says to him, "Come out." Then he had enough faith in that moment to step out over the side of the boat and he began to walk on water. What an amazing experience. But then, for some reason, he takes his eyes off of the one who calls him to walk on the water and begins to focus on how crazy it's looking out there. When things are crazy in your life, God is with you. There's no need to focus on the crazy things that are happening. If we keep our eyes on him, then our peace remains. If we keep our eyes on him, then our strength remains. We're able to push through the most difficult things, walk on the water, because he's the one who has called us to this. He's the one who's in it with us. He commands the winds and the waves. And so there is no reason to be afraid when we know who we are. We are his. And in the midst of the storm, we have to remember to keep our focus on him and not to focus on the crazy things. Focus on Jesus. Keep your eyes on him, right? Um, I'm done with this chapter. Next chapter, we're reading Mark 6. It says, Jesus left that part of the country and returned with his disciples to Nazareth, his hometown. The next Sabbath, he began teaching in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. They asked, "Where did he get all this wisdom and power to perform such miracles?" Then they scoffed. "He's just a carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. And his sisters live right here amongst us." They were deeply offended and refused to believe him. Then Jesus told them, "A prophet is honored everywhere except his own home and amongst his relatives and his own family." And because of their unbelief, he could do He couldn't do any miracles among them except to place hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Uh, so Jesus is in his hometown, and because the people are so familiar with him, they saw him growing up, they know his whole family, they know his history, they think. Um, they're not able to accept what he is bringing, right? They're not able to accept him for who he is, the Son of God. They see the miracles, they see the evidence, the wisdom, but they still find a way to discredit it. And it's encouragement for us, sometimes when we're walking in our calling, when we're trying to bless our families, bless the people around us with the gifts that are given to us, with the calling that we have on our lives, and they're not in support of it, or they're just looking down on the gift, right? Don't allow it to discourage you, because even Jesus had this experience with his own family and the people in his own community. They could not receive from him. He just had to move on, right? And so it's an encouragement for us that even Jesus had to go through this, right? Don't allow it to break you or discourage you. Keep moving, keep being a blessing, keep shining. Um, it says, then Jesus went from village to village, teaching the people. And he called his 12 disciples together and began sending them out two by two, giving them authority to cast out evil spirits. He told them to take nothing for their journey except a walking stick, no food, no traveler's bag, no money. He allowed them to wear sandals, but not to take a change of clothes. Wherever you go, he said, stay in the same house until you leave town. But if any place refuses to welcome you or listen to you, shake its dust off your feet as you leave to show that you have abandoned those people to their fate. So the disciples went out, telling everyone they met to repent of their sins and turn to God. And they cast out many demons and healed many sick people, anointing them with oil. Herod Antipas, the king, soon heard about Jesus because everyone was talking about him. So some were saying, this must be John the Baptist raised from the dead. That is why he can do such miracles. Others said, he's the prophet Elijah. Still, others said, he's a prophet like the other great prophets of the past. When Herod heard about Jesus, he said, John, the man I beheaded, has come back from the dead. For Herod had sent soldiers to arrest and imprison John as a favor to Herodias. She had been his brother Philip's wife, but Herod had married her. John had been telling Herod, it is against God's law for you to marry your brother's wife. So Herodias bore a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But without Herod's approval, she was powerless. For Herod respected John, and knowing that he was a good and holy man, he protected him. Herod was greatly disturbed whenever he talked with John, but even so, he liked to listen to him. Herodias' chance finally came on Herod's birthday. He gave a party for his high government officials, army officials, and the leading citizens of Galilee. Then his daughter, also named Herodias, came in and performed the dance that greatly pleased Herod and his guests. Ask me for anything you like, the king said to the girl. I will give it to you. He even vowed, I will give you whatever you ask, up to half of my kingdom. Why do they do that? She went out and asked her mother, what should I ask for? Her mother told her, ask for the head of John the Baptist. So the girl hurried back to the king and told him, I want the head of John the Baptist right now on a tree. Then the king deeply regretted what he had said, but because of the vow he had made in front of his guest, he couldn't refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner to the prison to cut off John's head and bring it to him. The soldier beheaded John in the prison, brought his head on a tree, and gave it to the girl, who took it to her mother. When John's disciples heard what had happened, they came to get his body and buried it in a tomb. She could have up to half the kingdom. Hate, right? Hate. She could have half of the kingdom, but instead she chooses to ask for the life of an innocent man. The apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all they had done and taught. Then Jesus said, "Let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while." He said this because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. So they left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone, taking time to rest. In soothing, you must also care for yourself. But many people recognized them and saw them leaving. And people from many towns ran ahead along the shore and got there ahead of them. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Late in the afternoon, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat." But Jesus said, "You feed them." "With what?" they asked. "We'd have to work for months to earn enough money to buy food for all these people." "How much bread do you have?" he asked. "Go and find out." They came back and reported, "We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." Then Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups on the grass. So they sat down in groups of 50 or 100. Then Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up towards heaven, and blessed them. Then, breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. He also divided the fish for everyone to share. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterwards the disciple picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. A total of 5,000 men and their families were fed. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida, while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them walking on water. He intended to go past them. But when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. Why was he intending to go past them? Hmm, that's interesting. Anyhow, but Jesus spoke to them and asked, "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Then he climbed into the boat and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. Isn't that amazing? They got to see him multiply these 5 little loaves and 2 fish, and they were still totally amazed. They did not understand fully who Jesus was. Aren't we grateful of how gracious God is, how merciful He is, how patient He is with us? Um, because they had just experienced this miracle, but they were still so amazed at the fact that He was able to command the winds and the waves, right? Which means they're probably limiting His power in their minds. They were limiting what He could do in their minds. And sometimes we are guilty of that. We say that God is, he has power over all things, he has control over all things, he commands all things. But then we get into a situation where, like, we begin to doubt. We're not sure that I'm not sure that we don't think he can do it. We wonder if he will do it, right? And maybe sometimes we wonder, can he actually do that? I think this is where the disciples were when they saw this miracle. They're like, whoa, he actually commands the winds and waves too. Um, so I just found that interesting. Um, after they had after they had crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret. They brought the boats to shore and climbed out. The people recognized Jesus at once, and they ran throughout the whole area, carrying sick people on mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went in villages, cities, or the countryside, they brought sick out to the marketplaces. They begged him to let the sick touch at least the fringe of his robes, and all who touched him were healed. Now we're moving on to Luke 9, chapter 9, verses 1 through 17. One day, Jesus called together his 12 disciples and gave them power and authority to cast out all demons and to heal all sick. Then he sent them out to tell everyone about the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. Take nothing for your journey, he instructed them. Don't take a walking stick, a traveler's bag, food, money, or even a change of clothes. Wherever you go, stay in the same house until you leave. And if a town refuses to welcome you, shake its dust from your feet as you leave to show that you have abandoned those people to their fate. So they began their circuit of the villages, preaching the good news and healing the sick. So we see here that Jesus sends them out. He sends them out to preach the good news, and he instructs them to take nothing. You need nothing more than just what you have with you. Why? Because this is the time they'll get to see God's provision, right? They're going to see his provision. They don't need to carry any baggage. They don't need to have any extended preparation, right? Just go as you are and do what I've asked you to do, and everything will be fine, basically, he's saying. And even when somebody resists you, just shake that off of you and keep going. That's just a reminder sometimes that when we feel called to do something, when God has given us an instruction, that we don't need to overthink it, right? There are sometimes He's going to say, prepare, and there are sometimes He's going to say, just go with what you have, right? Just go just as you are. I will give you what you need as you go, and that's the case um, in this short story. Verse 7 says, when Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, heard about, now I hope by now you're realizing we read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're all giving the same story, right? So these are three different people who've given their perspective, and you could see that they're all basically the same, slight differences, but they're able to corroborate each other's stories, right? It's one of the ways we know the Bible is true. It's when you see different people write the stories, they write, well, not the stories because these are historical events. It's all written, recorded, but you see the similarities in the writings, right? And so these stories, these recordings are all the same, with just slight differences in perspective, but nothing that raises any alarms. So we're about to read about Herod again. When Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, heard about everything Jesus was doing, he was puzzled. Some were saying that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead. Others thought Jesus was Elijah or one of the other prophets risen from the dead. I beheaded John, Herod said. So who is this man about whom I hear such stories? And he kept trying to see him. When the apostles returned, they told Jesus everything they had done. I lost my spot. There it is. Everything they had done. Then he slipped quietly away with them towards the town of Bethsaida. But the crowds found out where he was going, and they followed him. He welcomed them and taught them about the kingdom of God, and he healed those who were sick. Now, Jesus was trying to get away with the disciples because they had just finished serving. But this is what happens sometimes, right? They're just finished serving, they had nothing to eat, they were a little tired, and were about to get away. But there are people who need what you have. And sometimes we have to give, we have to serve even when we're tired. Sometimes we have to serve even when we're tired. That's when that extra grace from God is needed in order to show compassion and serve even in those times when we are tired. Um, Late in the afternoon, the 12 disciples came to him and said, "Send the crowds away to the nearby villages and farms so they can find food and lodging for the night. There is nothing to eat here in this remote place." But Jesus said, "You feed them." "But we have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Or are you expecting us to go and buy enough food for this whole crowd?" For there were about 5,000 men there. Jesus replied, "Tell them to sit down in groups of about 50 each." So the people all sat down. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up towards heaven, and blessed them. Then, breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread and fish to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterwards, the disciple picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. When God provides it, it's not just enough, right? He gave more than enough. He gave more than enough. What an amazing God we serve. So that is it for today's reading. Don't forget, we are here from Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. EST and back here on Saturdays at 8 a.m. EST. We would love to have you, right? Check us out on a Saturday for the Word with Pastor Courage Molina. Till next time, bye.